dig into a decades-old question that's getting new attention. How does knowledge actually move through organizations? And what does that mean for rural communities trying to absorb and apply new ideas? Plus, we look at what Vietnam, Brazil, Kenya, and South Africa are all doing at once that might be telling us something important about where rural innovation is headed globally. Stay with us. I'm Art.
I'm Jen.
And this is The Rural Innovator, a weekly look at the research, news, and projects shaping rural innovation, drawn from the library at ruralinnovations.org.
Let's start with the research this week. And honestly, it's a rich set. 3 articles, all foundational in their own way, but I want to begin with the one that surprised me most when I reread it with fresh eyes.
All right, walk me through it.
So this is a paper on knowledge transfer in intraorganizational networks. That's internal networks within a single large organization. The core question is, does where you sit in that network actually affect how innovative and how high-performing your business unit is? And the answer is yes, quite strongly.
Before we get into the findings, who did they study? What's the actual sample here?
Good question, and I want to be precise here because people sometimes overextend this one. The study is based on large, multi-unit organizations. It's not a study of small rural businesses or even regional development agencies. It's corporate network structure.
So the immediate instinct, apply this to a rural community network, is a stretch.
It's a stretch, but a useful one. Here's why I think it still belongs in our conversation. The paper identifies 2 distinct mechanisms. First, network centrality, being well-connected, being a hub, knowing who knows what. Second, absorptive capacity, the ability of a unit to recognize, value, and actually apply knowledge that comes from outside itself.
And those 2 things interact, or do they work independently?
Both, actually. And that's what makes the paper interesting. Centrality helps you receive knowledge. Absorptive capacity determines whether you do anything useful with it. A unit that's well-connected but can't absorb what it receives doesn't outperform. The combination is what drives innovation and performance.
Okay, so I'm thinking about a rural municipality that's plugged into a regional innovation network. Maybe they've got a seat at the table, they're hearing about new programs, new funding. But if the staff capacity isn't there to understand and implement what's being offered, that connection doesn't help.
That's exactly the translation I'd make. And it's a sobering one, because a lot of rural innovation policy focuses almost entirely on connectivity. Broadband, networks, partnerships, seats at the table. The absorptive capacity side gets much less attention.
Which raises a practical question. Can you build absorptive capacity deliberately? Is this something you can train for, or is it more structural?
The paper leans toward, yes, it's buildable. Prior knowledge base matters. Organizations and communities that have invested in education and learning are better positioned to recognize and use new knowledge when it arrives. It's not magic. It compounds over time.
That feels like an argument for sustained investment in local expertise rather than one-time capacity injections, which is a hard sell politically.
It is. And I want to flag the limitation clearly. This research is now a couple of decades old, and the organizational context is quite specific. But the conceptual scaffolding holds up well, and you see it echoed in more recent rural innovation literature.
The finding I keep coming back to is this. Being at the center of a network is necessary but not sufficient. That's a message that doesn't always get heard in rural development circles, where the goal is often just to get connected.
Right. Connection without capacity is just noise. Let's move to the second article, which pairs with this one quite naturally.
Open innovation, Chesbro's big idea.
Exactly. So this is the paper that introduced open innovation as a formal framework. The idea that organizations no longer need to rely solely on internal research and development to innovate. They can deliberately bring in external knowledge, partner with outside organizations, license technologies, and so on.
And the contrast is with what? The traditional closed model, where everything happens inside the firm?
Right. The old model assumes that if you invest in R&D internally and protect your intellectual property carefully, you win. The open innovation model says that's increasingly untenable. Knowledge moves too fast, the talent is too distributed, and the costs of developing everything internally are too high.
Which makes intuitive sense for a large tech company. But how does this land in a rural context?
This is where I actually think the rural application is stronger than it might first appear. Rural organizations, whether we're talking about agricultural cooperatives, regional development authorities, or small manufacturers, have almost never had the option of closed innovation. They don't have big internal R&D budgets. They've always had to borrow and adapt.
So rural communities have been doing open innovation by necessity, without calling it that.
Precisely. And I think that's actually an underappreciated asset. There's a kind of institutional humility built into rural organizations, a comfort with saying, we didn't invent this, but we can adapt it. That's a real capability.
I'd push back slightly on that, though. There's a difference between adapting out of necessity and having a deliberate, managed process for doing it. The framework Chesbrough describes is strategic. It's about knowing where your gaps are, who has the knowledge you need, and building the relationships to access it.
That's a fair push. Improvised knowledge borrowing is not the same as a managed open innovation strategy. And you're right that a lot of rural organizations are doing the former, not the latter.
Which brings us back to the absorptive capacity point from the first paper. Even if you're open to external knowledge in principle, you need the capacity to evaluate what's worth bringing in and what isn't.
These two papers really do read as a pair. One tells you that network position matters. The other tells you that you can expand who's in your network on purpose. Together, they're saying, be intentional about both your connections and your capacity to learn from them.
And for a rural economic development office, that might mean being explicit about what outside knowledge they're actually trying to import, not just showing up to every regional meeting and hoping something useful rubs off.
Well said. Now, the third paper this week is a bit of a different register. It's about responsible innovation governance. And I think it's the one that challenges our assumptions the most.
All right, lay it out.
So this paper comes out of a UK geoengineering research project, a context about as far from rural Saskatchewan as you can get. But the framework the authors develop is genuinely portable. They identify 4 dimensions of responsible innovation: anticipation, reflexivity, inclusion, and responsiveness.
Let's take those one at a time. Anticipation. That's forward-looking?
Right. It's about systematically thinking through what might happen if an innovation is deployed. Not just the intended effects, but the unintended ones. Who benefits? Who bears the risk? What could go wrong at scale?
And reflexivity?
That's the hardest one to operationalize. It means the researchers or innovators are actively examining their own assumptions, their own blind spots, asking, why do I think this is a good idea? What am I taking for granted? It requires a kind of intellectual discomfort.
You're describing a skill that's genuinely rare.
It is, and the paper is honest about that. Then inclusion, which is about broadening who gets a voice in shaping innovation, not just the scientists and funders, but the communities that'll be affected.
Now that one lands hard in a rural context, because historically, rural communities have been on the receiving end of innovations designed elsewhere. Agricultural technology developed for large-scale operations that doesn't fit a small mixed farm. Infrastructure built to urban specs that doesn't fit rural geography.
Exactly. The inclusion dimension of this framework is essentially an argument for co-design, for bringing affected communities into the process before the solution is finalized, not after.
And the fourth dimension, responsiveness?
That's the governance piece. Even if you've anticipated, reflected, and included, you need mechanisms to actually change course if something goes wrong. Responsive governance means the system can adapt, not just in theory, but in practice.
And that requires institutional flexibility, which rural areas sometimes have more of, actually. Smaller organizations can pivot faster than large bureaucracies.
That's an interesting reframe. I'd want to test it. Smaller organizations can also be more risk-averse when resources are thin. But yes, the structural agility argument has merit.
What's the limitation of this framework, in your read?
It was developed in the context of emerging science and technology, geoengineering specifically, where the stakes are enormous and the uncertainties are deep. For more incremental, everyday rural innovation, some of this governance apparatus might feel heavy. You don't need a full anticipation process to decide whether to adopt a new irrigation system.
Though you might want some version of the inclusion piece even then.
Fair. The inclusion and reflexivity dimensions are probably the most universally applicable. The full framework is most useful when the innovation is genuinely novel and the consequences are hard to predict.
Okay, 3 strong papers this week. What I take from all 3 together is something like, be connected. Be strategic about what knowledge you're pulling in, make sure you have the capacity to use it, and build governance that lets affected communities shape the process. That's a coherent program.
It really is. And it's not a program that requires a large city or a major research institution to execute. All 3 of those things are achievable at a rural regional scale.
Let's get into the news. A busy week globally. Vietnam, Brazil, Kenya, South Africa. John, where do you want to start?
Let's start with Vietnam, because the story there is about deliberate policy architecture, which connects directly to what we were just saying about governance.
What's the strategy?
Vietnam's Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Development is launching a new rural development strategy running from 2026 to 2030. The headline shift is that it moves away from prioritizing traditional infrastructure, roads, buildings, utilities, and toward innovation, digital transformation, and sustainable rural economies.
That's a significant pivot for a country that's spent decades trying to close the infrastructure gap between urban and rural areas.
It is, and the ambition is substantial. They're aiming to bring over 90% of communes up to new rural standards under this program, with a specific focus on digital tools and innovation capacity at the commune level.
90% of communes? Do we have a sense of the scale? Vietnam has a lot of communes.
Thousands. This is a countrywide rural transformation strategy, not a pilot program. The ambition is national in scope.
And what's the mechanism? Is it top-down, the ministry sets standards and communes comply? Or is there something more participatory built in?
The reporting doesn't give us enough detail on implementation structure to say definitively. What's clear is that it's ministry-led, and the targets are set nationally. Whether the inclusion dimension we were just discussing is baked in, I genuinely don't know.
That's honest. And it's an important caveat, because a national strategy that tells rural communities what kind of digital transformation they're getting isn't the same as one that starts from what those communities actually need.
Right. But I don't want to be dismissive of the scale of the commitment. Moving national rural development policy explicitly toward innovation and digital transformation is meaningful, regardless of the implementation details we can't see.
Agreed. What's the Brazil story? There seem to be two distinct threads there.
There are. The first is about Brazil's agricultural sector itself, the macro picture, and it's genuinely striking. Brazil's ag sector is under severe economic pressure right now. High interest rates, low commodity prices. 8.3% of farmers are delinquent on loan payments. That's a significant stress indicator.
And yet the sector is apparently responding with expansion rather than contraction?
Yes, that's the counterintuitive part. Rather than pulling back, Brazilian agriculture diversified its export markets and expanded into new regions. Beef exports grew by 39.9% in 2025.
That's a stunning number. 39.9% growth in a single year in the middle of a credit crisis.
It is, and the story is that Brazilian agribusinesses responded to financial stress with innovation, finding new buyers, new crops, new geographies. It's a kind of pressure-driven diversification.
Which is interesting from an economic development perspective, but I'd want to know more about who's benefiting. Large agribusiness diversifying export markets is a very different story from small family farmers navigating a debt crisis.
That's the question I'd want answered too. The article frames it as a sector-wide response, but the delinquency rate tells us that not all producers are thriving.
What's the IFAD piece?
The International Fund for Agricultural Development, IFAD, has opened a new office in Salvador, which is in Brazil's northeastern region. The focus is explicitly on Brazil's northeast, which has historically been left behind in the country's agricultural boom.
Salvador, the capital of Bahia, Bahia. That's a deliberate geographic choice.
Very deliberate. IFAD has invested about $1.1 billion across Brazil overall and supported nearly 1 million families through programs focused on smallholder farmers, food security, and rural poverty. The new office is about deepening that work in a region that's often underserved, even within Brazil's relatively prosperous agricultural landscape.
There's something worth noting here about the geography of rural innovation investment. Even within countries that are agricultural powerhouses, the investment tends to cluster in the more prosperous regions. Brazil's center-west gets the attention. The northeast gets the office IFAD just opened.
That pattern, innovation investment following existing prosperity rather than filling gaps, is one of the persistent structural problems in regional development. It's not unique to Brazil.
Not at all. Let's talk about the Kenya story because this one caught my attention for different reasons.
The robotics program in Laikipia County. Yes, a Kenyan educator running robotics clubs in rural Kenya, training 200 students in engineering and problem solving. One team competed at the World Robotics Olympiad in Singapore.
From Laikipia to Singapore, that's a remarkable arc.
It is. And the program is designed around applications that are relevant to the students' actual context, space missions and agricultural robotics. So they're not just learning to code in the abstract. They're connecting the technology to problems they recognize.
That grounding matters enormously. There's a lot of STEM education in rural areas that imports a curriculum designed for suburban contexts and wonders why engagement is low.
Exactly. The contextualization, making the learning relevant to place, is one of the things that seems to be working here. The program is funded by a U.S. nonprofit, which raises its own questions about sustainability and local ownership.
That's my concern too. External funding for a program like this creates vulnerability. If the nonprofit changes priorities or loses funding, does the program survive?
We don't know. And it's a question worth asking of any externally funded rural innovation initiative. The Laikipia story is genuinely inspiring, but the long-term question is always, what's the path to local ownership?
And South Africa, the Mpumalanga story.
This one is quieter in tone, but, I'd argue, significant in what it shows about targeted intervention design. 25 women farmers in Mpumalanga province transformed their operations through a focused training program funded by the African Development Bank.
25 people. That's a small cohort.
Very small, but the combination of what the program offered is worth looking at. Digital tools, mentorship, and financial literacy training, all together, not as separate initiatives. The integration is what I think is interesting.
Because you could offer any one of those three things and get limited results. Digital tools without financial literacy means people have apps they can't use strategically. Financial literacy without mentorship means knowledge without support.
Right. The bundled approach and the fact that it's targeted specifically at women farmers who face compounding barriers in most rural agricultural contexts seems to be the design insight here.
The article frames it as a quiet revolution, and I think that framing is actually right. It's not a dramatic policy announcement or a $100 million program. It's 25 women, well-supported, with measurable changes in their farming operations.
And presumably the knowledge they now hold doesn't disappear when the program ends. That's the durable investment.
Which circles back to absorptive capacity again. Good programs build the capacity to receive and use future knowledge, not just the knowledge itself.
Well said. Let's move to organizations and events.
This week, the organizations piece is really embedded in what we've already been discussing. The IFAD office opening in Salvador is a meaningful development in terms of the organizational landscape for rural development in Brazil's northeast. But I want to spend a moment on what IFAD actually does, because I think it's worth understanding the scope.
IFAD, the International Fund for Agricultural Development, is a UN-specialized agency focused specifically on rural poverty. It's not a general development bank. Its mandate is rural, and its focus is on smallholder agriculture, food security, and the households that agricultural policy most often underserves.
And their Brazil portfolio, $1.1 billion, nearly 1 million families, tells you this isn't a marginal player. Establishing a presence in Salvador means they're signaling a long-term commitment to the Northeast specifically.
The institutional question I'd ask is, does an IFAD office in Salvador change the incentive structure for other investors and programs? If a major UN agricultural development fund is signaling that the Northeast is worth serious attention, does that attract co-investment?
That's the catalytic theory of anchor institutions. And it does sometimes work. A credible, well-resourced organization moving into a region can reduce the perceived risk for other actors.
It can also create dependency. If the anchor leaves, the ecosystem it attracted can collapse. We've seen that in rural North America too. Federal program offices close, and the organizations that grew around them don't survive.
So the question for the Northeast Brazil story isn't just whether IFAD is there. It's whether they're building local organizational capacity that would persist if IFAD eventually wound down operations.
Exactly. The other organizational piece worth flagging this week is the Robotics program in Laikipia, specifically as a model for rural STEM infrastructure. It's not a formal organization in the way we usually mean, but it's a program architecture that other rural regions could study.
The architecture being, identify a credible local educator, give them external funding and equipment, connect the curriculum to locally relevant problems, and create a pathway for the students to participate in global competitions.
That last element, the global competition piece, shouldn't be underestimated. Competing at the World Robotics Olympiad in Singapore means students in rural Kenya have a tangible, visible demonstration that their work is world-class. That has effects on aspiration and self-concept that are hard to quantify, but very real.
I've seen similar dynamics in rural Canada. When young people in small communities get external validation for what they're doing, it changes what they believe is possible for themselves and for their community.
The risk, of course, is brain drain. Students who develop world-class skills in rural areas often have to leave to use them. The program is building capacity that may not stay in Laikipia.
That tension is probably impossible to fully resolve. But there's a version of this where even those who leave maintain connection to and investment in their home region. Diaspora networks can be powerful development assets.
Agreed. And it's better to produce skilled people who leave than to produce no skilled people. Though I know not everyone in rural development would agree with that statement.
It's a genuine debate. Let's talk about events. Anything worth flagging for listeners this week?
The library didn't surface specific events this week, but I'd point listeners toward ruralinnovations.org for the full archive. There are often calls for papers and upcoming conferences that get added through the week. The briefing this week was research and news heavy, which is a good problem to have.
All right, let's get into closing thoughts. I want to try to hold this week's content together and see what pattern emerges, because I think there is one.
Go ahead. I'm curious where you're taking this.
Okay, look at the geography we covered this week. Vietnam, Brazil, twice, Kenya, South Africa. And the research, organizational network theory, open innovation, responsible governance. What strikes me is that the global news items aren't just interesting individual stories. They're all, in different ways, running the same experiment.
Say more.
Each of those stories is about a rural community or region that's trying to absorb and apply external knowledge, whether it's digital tools in Mpumalanga, robotics curricula in Laikipia, or innovation frameworks from Hanoi. And the question in every case is the same. Does the absorptive capacity exist to actually use what's being offered?
That's a clean read, and I think it holds. What you're pointing to is that the research and the news are actually describing the same problem from different angles. The network paper describes the mechanism. The global stories are the empirical cases.
And what the cases seem to show is that the programs that work, the Mpumalanga women farmers, the Laikipia robotics clubs, are the ones that invest in capacity before or alongside the knowledge transfer. They don't just drop tools or curricula and walk away.
The bundled intervention design, skills plus mentorship plus tools, together. That's the Mpumalanga model explicitly, and it seems to be implicit in the Laikipia program too.
Whereas the Vietnam strategy, 90% of communes, digital transformation, is the kind of ambitious policy that I'd worry about on exactly this dimension. The target is connectivity and digital adoption. But if absorptive capacity isn't being built at the same time, you end up with communes that have the tools and not the capacity to use them well.
Though I want to push back slightly on the Vietnam skepticism. Vietnam has a strong national education system and a history of implementing large-scale rural development programs with some effectiveness. It's not the same context as, say, imposing a digital strategy on communities with no prior digital infrastructure or training.
That's fair. I'm pattern matching to cases I've seen in Canada where national digital adoption targets got met on paper but not in practice. Vietnam may have built enough absorptive capacity already that the strategy is more likely to work.
Context specificity is everything in this field. Which brings me to the responsible innovation paper, and the dimension of it I think deserves more attention, reflexivity.
Examining your own assumptions.
Right. The thing that connects all the frameworks we discussed today, network theory, open innovation, responsible governance, is that they all require the actors involved to have some self-awareness about what they don't know. The network paper says, know your position and your gaps. The open innovation model says, know what you don't have internally. The governance framework says, examine what you take for granted.
And that's a kind of organizational virtue that's genuinely hard to cultivate, especially in resource-constrained environments where there's pressure to move fast and show results.
Which is most rural innovation contexts. The pressure to demonstrate impact to funders, to show that programs are working, can be the enemy of the kind of slow, reflexive thinking that would actually improve them.
I'd add that the open innovation model has one implication that I don't think gets enough attention in rural policy circles. It legitimizes not having invented something yourself. There's a culture in some rural development spaces where programs that adapted an idea from somewhere else are seen as less valuable than homegrown innovation.
That's a really interesting cultural observation, and I think it has real consequences. It can lead to reinventing wheels that have already been well-engineered elsewhere, because admission of borrowing feels like admission of inadequacy.
Whereas the Chesbrough framing says, deliberately importing and adapting external knowledge is itself a sophisticated innovation strategy. You're not failing to innovate. You're practicing open innovation.
Reframing knowledge adoption as a strategic capability rather than a consolation prize. I like that.
The Brazil agri sector story is actually a good example. Growing beef exports by 40% in a crisis year probably involved a lot of borrowed market intelligence, borrowed logistics relationships, borrowed distribution networks. That's not lesser innovation. It's adaptive capability under pressure.
And it connects back to the IFAD presence in Salvador. If you're building rural development capacity in a region, part of what you're doing is giving those communities better access to global knowledge networks, better absorptive capacity, better connections, better governance frameworks.
So the whole week, in some ways, is a conversation about the same thing. How does knowledge get from where it exists to where it's needed, and what determines whether it's actually used well once it arrives?
That's the question. And I don't think we fully answered it. I'm not sure anyone has. But I think naming it clearly is valuable. Rural innovation policy often focuses on the supply side, creating knowledge, funding research, building infrastructure. The demand side, the capacity to absorb, adapt, and apply, is less resourced and less studied.
Which means there's probably a lot of value left on the table in rural communities that are technically connected to good knowledge networks, but don't have the internal capacity to use what they're receiving.
That's my read, and it's an argument for a different kind of rural innovation investment, one that's as focused on building internal capability as it is on external connectivity.
Not just the pipe, but what flows through it, and whether there's anyone on the other end who knows what to do with it.
Exactly. Good week for thinking.
Good week for thinking.
That's the week. The full library, every article we discussed, and the newsletter that started this whole conversation are at ruralinnovations.org.
See you next Friday.